Well, our topics for this afternoon are the two truths and a topic that's called in Tibetan Tangye, which means the definitive and the interpretable, or that which requires interpretation and that which is definitive. So they're always treated as distinct topics, in Tibetan Buddhist discussions. But they're actually very closely linked. The Buddha, taught many different things and to different things to different people on different days. And he didn't write my system by the Buddha. Do you know what I'm saying? He told this person ask a question, and then he answered that person, and then another day he gave a discourse on something else, and then the next day he answered a different question from somebody else, and it wasn't so obvious how all of this fit together in a system. So some early commentators, had to sit down and kind of sort out how to put all this together, right? And one of the things that they did very early on was create this distinction between the two truths. Maybe you thought I was going to say the interpretable and the definitive, but no, it's actually, this is the, where the idea of the two truths comes from, that there's like some things that the Buddha taught, which represent his ultimate teaching, and other things that don't. So, for example, the Buddha famously said, I was sitting underneath the tree, and through such and such and such and such and such, I came to complete and perfect awakening. And then, after a time, I got up and went out, to preach the Dharma for the benefit of the world, for the benefit out of compassion and care for all the people. So in that, he doesn't say anything about emptiness or no self. In fact, and what he does is refer to persons out in the world and himself with the first person singular pronoun, and not doing anything to undermine the status of those, just positing them as, elements in the teaching, not things to be overcome, right? But then in other times, he would explain this idea of no self, that, we have this constructed idea of grasping onto a self that is ultimately unsubstantiated when we look to see, what's actually there. So the early commentators, where they would, in order to, seek a method to reconcile or make a coherent system out of the different things that Buddha had said, sometimes talking about himself and sometimes saying that there's no self, right? Then this idea of two truths was, developed very early in Buddhism. And so my point is that the two truths started, in its origin in the Buddhist tradition historically seems to have been very specifically the process of interpreting statements of the Buddha. Okay, so I'm just saying that because there we understand ultimate truth and conventional truth appears as one topic, and then scriptures, which are either definitive or requiring interpretation, appears as a different topic, but it's actually two aspects of the same thing. So it turns out that, scriptures that are considered definitive are ones that point at the ultimate truth. And this is the way that term was understood even from the very beginning in Buddhism, very early on. And other teachings that the Buddha gave that point at conventional truths were understood as being conventionally true, or being true in a conventional sense, but not under ultimate analysis, right? So that's how this fits together. So I used the word hermeneutic in this morning, and I explained it. And I think that's another way of saying what I just said, is that hermeneutic means interpreting, how to go about interpreting. And we interpret the world all the time. As we look at it, we see things, and then we form ideas about what we're seeing and what it means, hear things, form ideas, interpret it, right, in our minds, trying to make sense out of it, right? And so you could say that that's like a kind of philosophical hermeneutic, that we look around the world, we look and interact with other people and try to interpret what's going on. And in the same way, when you look at a book and read it and then try to say which passages are definitive and which ones require interpretation, that's, a different kind of hermeneutic. The true truths is my topic for the first part. And so we usually say the conventional truth and the ultimate truth, and we'll talk more about each of these in detail and maybe like a different way of talking about conventional truth. But Nagarjuna says, one of the verses in chapter 24 of Mula Madhyamaka Karyasika says, the teachings of the Buddha rely upon the two truths, and you have to know these two truths to understand Buddha's teaching, and you have to know, the two truths, both of them, to understand the Buddha's teaching. Why? Because you need the conventional in order to point out the ultimate, and you need the ultimate in order to attain liberation. So that's a pretty close to a quote from one verse from Nagarjuna. So that doesn't really make it clear what the final status of the conventional is, but it just like makes clear that you're going to need it, at least for instrumental purposes in the process of trying to get enlightened. You get just like, all these conventional truths, let's throw all those out and just stick with the ultimate, because you don't have any way to understand or know or think about or talk about what that is. And I think to some extent that fits with Tsongkhapa's project. Chandrakirti, very much in line with Nagarjuna, emphasizes the two truths in his Madhyamaka Avatara, which is a supplement to the Middle Way. He devotes several verses, 5 or 6 verses, to talking about and then commenting on his own explanation of the two truths. And then that becomes the basis for Tsongkhapa's discussion of the two truths in some detail in both the medium exposition of the stage of the path and then in his elucidation of the thought. And so I'm just going to go through some topics about the two truths and the categories, of discussion and analysis from the Gelukpa literature about how to understand these two. And the first thing is, what are the two truths two of? Which seems like it would be the easiest possible question, because I just said they were the two truths. But that is like not the right answer, as you might guess. Yeah, because they're not actually two truths in the Gelukpa explanation at all. In fact, conventional truth, although we call it truth, it's understood as like things that do not exist as they appear, versus ultimate truth, which is something that exists as it appears to the mind that directly knows it, right? Whereas conventional truths exist in one way and appear in another way, right? So in that sense, they're not really truths. They're you could say the word in Tibetan is dzunba instead of demba. They're falsities. Usually it doesn't make a very good word in English to say falsity, but like, what is the nominal? You don't want to, you could say lies, sounds a little bit bad, but yeah, there's like things that misrepresent themselves, those bad things. Of course, it's not really the things. It's like, for the nature of our minds, we're not able to see these things as they are. So the basis of division, in other words, can't be truths, because pretty much everybody agrees, and this is the way Chandrakirti explains it, is that the conventional truth is really that which is mistaken as a truth by ignorance. So ignorance takes these things and just accepts them as they appear but they don't exist as they appear. There's a discordance between the way they appear and the way they exist. So, to take them as truths is to be a fool. So like, it's like gold and fool's gold. Are those two types of gold? It's exactly like that. That's what it is, right? My teachers had more, other examples. But I think that one works really well. Just think like two types of gold, gold and fool's gold. Then you have the idea that, okay, it's not two types of gold. What is it two types of then? It needs to be two types of something, right? And so people have different interpretations of this in Tibetan Buddhism. And Tsongkhapa says that the right answer is objects of knowledge, sheja. Objects of knowledge is the right. There are two different types of objects of knowledge. Two different things that, and it's quite important, this for a number of reasons. Sheja, objects of knowledge, means things which are to be known, shebar jawa, things that we can and ought to come to know. So it doesn't mean some stuff that doesn't exist but we stupidly think does, and some other stuff that really, really, truly, absolutely exists. It doesn't mean that. There's two types of things to be known, right? So even though we're saying that the conventional truth actually means fool's gold, does fool's gold exist? Yes. And if you want to know about all the different kinds of things that are called gold, or all the different kinds of minerals or whatever, you will have to take into account fool's gold, whatever that is. It has a name, I'm sure, as a mineral, right? All right. So that's something that exists, something to be known. So it's like that. If, ultimately it means that if you're a Buddha, then you fully and completely and thoroughly and simultaneously know all of these objects, right? The conventional and the ultimate. So people say many other things. I mean, there are other answers, right? And I'm not going to go through all the other answers that people give about what the basis of division is. But I'll just say a couple of them. One of the most common ones, I think it's hard for me to point to an exact example in the Tibetan tradition, but it's super common in interpretive secondary literature that explains about Buddhism and tries to explain Buddhist philosophy, is that the two truths aren't two different things to be known. They're two different ways of looking at the same thing. So, and this is not a totally insane idea at all. Two different perspectives, right? The perspective of the awakened yogi and our perspective. So the two truths are two ways of looking, two perspectives on whatever is in this room, right? And, Tsongkhapa, the whole tradition, on the one hand, they want to say that there is a way of looking at the world that gives us useful information that's on the conventional level. And there's another way of looking at the world that gives us useful information on the ultimate level. So there are these two kinds of perspectives, but that's not the two truths. The two truths are the objects that are known by these two different kinds of perspectives. That's what it emphasizes. So the point of changing it, saying that it's the things that exist, all the things that exist, are either the conventional truth or the ultimate truth. It's these things both exist. If we start the other way and say there are two different ways of looking at the world, well, which is the good way? I want to look at the better way. I'm going to look at it the ultimate way, right? And it's hard when you take the two perspectives. I mean, it's theoretically possible, but it tends to lead to a supersessionist approach. In other words, that there's the inferior way to look at things, and then there's the better way of looking at things. Well, if you say it's not two ways of looking at things, it's two kinds of things that exist. And it happens to be that one kind of thing that exists is seen with a certain kind of mind, through a certain kind of perspective, and another thing that also exists is seen with a different kind of mind. But it's not those minds. Those minds themselves are conventional truths. So I would say they're all in the conventional truth, and then ultimate truth is the emptiness of all those conventional things. I don't know if I should spell that out. Like ultimate truth refers to emptiness or suchness, right? Buddha nature, essentially the ultimate reality. And the conventional truth refers to those things which are empty, the other all the phenomena that exist other than emptiness, are conventional truths. So that's one wrong perspective, right? According to Tsongkhapa. Another one is just an example of one that comes from the Tibetan tradition is unanalyzed phenomena. That is, before we analyze and look into things, right? So we're looking around at the appearances in the world. There's two truths, but the implication being that once we analyze and look into things, there'll only be one left. Right? So Tsongkhapa doesn't want to say that, right? He wants to say that conventional truths exist, even though they present themselves to our minds deceptively, and ultimate truths also exist, right? And so he doesn't want to say, the basis of division is unanalyzed phenomena. The advantage of that is at least you're saying, that these are all phenomena. But the implication is, when you look into it closely, some of these phenomena aren't really real. So anyway, he rejects those, and there's a lot of, and so there's a quote from, it's backed up by sutra quotations. I believe it's the Meeting of the Father and Son Sutra, which is a Mahayana sutra, which is the sutra basis for saying that objects of knowledge are the basis of division of the two truths. Right. Okay. So that's the first topic. The second topic is the division of the two truths. The idea is that this is a absolutely comprehensive division of everything that exists, that there isn't anything else that exists except for these truths. There's no third truth. So there's things that present themselves to our mind in a deceptive way, and then there's emptiness, which presents itself to our mind when we see it as, the way it actually is. So if you were thinking about the two truths as two perspectives, one of which got at conventional phenomena and one of which got at the ultimate phenomena, then you could maybe then talk about a third truth, which was the way that the Buddha is able to see all conventional phenomena and all ultimate phenomena at the same time. Do you see what I'm saying? And because the Gelukpas are saying it's not perspectives. This is a catalog of everything that exists. His Holiness one time talked about, there's so many lists in Buddhism, and some of these lists are the number is fixed in the nature of things and the Dharma. And sometimes the number is, sort of a skill and means that just it could be stated otherwise, right? So, for example, there are different lists of how many bodies the Buddha has, and they're not that two bodies is different or wrong than four bodies. So, how many should we debate? Whether it's a 3-body theory, a 4-body theory. It's like it's just how you want to talk. But the Four Noble Truths, on the other hand, it's like there's not going to be a fifth one, right? Well, what about the 6 perfections, right? You think, is that... Yes, thank you, right? There's also a list of 10 perfections, exactly. So he's giving this as a counterexample. He said that, there's lists that are not definitive, but just, helpful. And then there are other lists that are definitive and there's not going to be any change in it. So like the two truths is like that. There's just definitely two truths, not going to be a third. So it's true, and we'll talk about maybe this a little bit later, but the idea in Gelukpa is that a Buddha is able to simultaneously and without confusion, perfectly and directly, spontaneously know conventional truths and ultimate truths without getting them in any way mixed up. So in Chinese philosophy, this provided, the idea that, that we definitely need a third truth to represent. It's like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. If there's emptiness and there's the things that are empty, they just felt that there was a need to have a third truth that transcended both of the other two truths, right? Yeah. Well, what is it? What is the truth that is the final nature of both the ultimate truth and the conventional truth? That's an actual question. Do you know?
Oh, Buddha's mind.
Yeah, or the ultimate truth. I mean, emptiness or the ultimate truth is the final nature of both the ultimate truth and the conventional truth. So in that sense, you don't need a third one, because the question about what is it that's the ultimate nature of these two truths, the answer is already built into the question, because it's the ultimate truth that's the final nature. On the other hand, if you say, well, when we're talking about this, we want to know, we're concerned about how people look at the world. I mean, there's fundamentally an epistemological dimension to this. Then you end up say, well, the third truth, which Gelukpa doesn't have, but the thing that's equivalent to it in Gelukpa is the Buddha's mind, which is a perspective in which you don't have to pick which truth you're looking at. Okay. Okay. Next. The two truths are mutually exclusive. They contradict one another in a sense, in their Gelwa. They're mutually contradictory. So they form a dichotomy of all things that exist. There isn't a thing that we can point at and say, that thing is both a conventional truth and an ultimate truth. And we'll have to talk about that more, because it's what about form? What about form? Form, is that an ultimate truth or a conventional truth? Well, it's definitely a conventional truth. Yeah, but its nature is to be empty. That's true. So if we're talking about the emptiness of form, that's an ultimate truth. But if you're talking about form, that's a conventional truth. This is the way Gelukpa looks at it and explains it. You can't name anything or point at anything or talk about anything that is both of the two truths. Things either exist as they appear or they don't exist as they appear, right? And so you have this kind of dichotomy. Now, with some kinds of contradictories, what it means for things to be contradictory implies that they can't possibly be together. I don't know, the traditional example of in Tibet was crows and owls. Obviously, you don't have any birds which are both crows and owls, right? So in that sense, they're contradictory. But in addition, they won't live in the same tree together. They're not going to be in the same nest, the crows and the owl. It's in the nature to, apparently, I don't know this. I'm just saying that's what the textbooks say. That's what I read in my logic manual. I've translated from Tibetan. I have no direct knowledge of the behavior of crows or owls. Crows and owls do not abide together, right? Mutually, they have an agreement to not be together, okay? So that's an example of things that are contradictory, like neither one is the other. But they're not a dichotomy of all birds, let alone objects of knowledge. And in addition, it's in their nature to never be together. Whereas with the two truths, and this is where it starts to get, you have to focus your mind a little bit. Even though there's nothing that is both, and they're completely contradictory to one another, they're always together. Well, with the exceptions we can mention, but in general, they're always together. They're all right here together, always, all the time. You can't. There's no way you can split apart. You can take this and split apart. So you can talk about form and the emptiness of the form. You can conceptually understand, but you can't pull them apart and say emptiness of form has now been isolated in the laboratory, separate from form. The redness of red tables is now something that has nothing to do with tables anymore because we isolated in a test tube. That's not a thing, right? So they're not only can they be together, they have to be together. They're always right there together, even though neither one is the other. Yeah. I think that takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's not impossible to get used to it. It is. So I tried to explain it on an earlier visit to Tse Chen Ling by holding up the picture of the rabbit duck, and it is definitely, the whole picture is a picture of a rabbit. But then looked at it in a different way, the whole picture is definitely a picture of a duck. Okay, so it's not that the rabbit is the duck and the duck is the rabbit, but that thing, is simultaneously in the same place, able to be seen in two different ways, where it has these contradictory aspects that appear. Yeah. So we'll look at this more. So the next thing to say, in addition to the fact that they're contradictory and they're dichotomy, but they're, unlike some dichotomies, they don't displace one another. Not only do they not displace one another, but the Gelukpa tradition says they're one entity. That means that they're right there together. So anything you can name or point at, and generally chair, for example, with regard to that, there exists a conventional truth, and actually a whole bunch of conventional truths and an ultimate truth. So with regard to the chair, we can say there's the chair, the color of the chair, the shape of the chair, the height of the chair, the emptiness of the chair. These are all things that are all right there, right together at the same time. Do you see what I'm saying? You can't pull them apart. So they're a single entity. I just thought of the rabbit duck example because, you can think about, like, we say, what do we say? Two faces of the same coin, right? And it's like that. Except if you can imagine that the coin has no thickness. If you imagine a coin, the coin's going to be very thin. It's like infinitely thin, so it has no thickness at all, right? But that it has a heads and a tails. It's like that. Heads is not tails. Tails is not heads. They're always right there together, right? But depending on how you look, you see one or the other. Did you have a question, Min?
I do have a question. From some of the Zen literature, in one way, and maybe you can give an interpretation of this example that they give, is that when you look at the mountain in the beginning, there is a mountain.
Yeah.
And then when you look at and then you do some meditation, and you look at the mountain again, it's no longer a mountain. But in the end, you look at the mountain again, it's still a mountain.
Yeah. Does it say still a mountain it's a mountain?
It's a mountain.
Yeah. It's not the same thing as saying it's still a mountain.
Right.
Because still a mountain would imply that it's the same mountain that it was before. And that's not the way I would interpret. You're right. I understand that sense saying, right? The idea, like, we see a mountain and it's self-evident to us that that's a real mountain that exists right there. And you meditate, and in this way, you say you meditate on the emptiness of the mountain and try to find the mountain on the side of the mountain, going out and looking for the mountain in all these things that you're designating as a mountain. You've designated this as a mountain, so let's go and look and see, where the mountainness of the mountain is. And then, the Dalai Lama likes to say that, if it really were a mountain objectively from its own side, then when we looked closer, it should get clearer and clearer and clearer and clearer that it's a mountain. And instead, it gets vaguer and vaguer. And it becomes less clear about exactly what the mountainness is, until you get the mountain seems to have disappeared. That it's unfindable. It's unfindable with a kind of mind that searches out for an essentially existent objective mountain nature. And so that could be like in the Zen, the ox herding pictures. That's like, the eighth picture, which is, just a great empty circle. You don't, everything has vanished into non-dual realization of emptiness. You don't think of yourself as a person realizing emptiness or thinking about emptiness exists or mountains exist. You realize the ultimate unfindability of anything. But then you don't stay there. That would be, if you stayed there, that would be like Buddha still sitting underneath the tree today. This nirvana thing, so good. Why would I get up? Right. Do you see what I'm saying? That's not what he did. He got up and he trudged around northern India in the blazing heat with no air conditioning, right? And, in order to help people who didn't understand what the heck he was saying, a lot of the time, right? So that's, when you emerge from meditative equipoise on emptiness, mountains appear. Is it the same mountain that you saw before? Well, no, not really. I mean, there is a mountain there, but now you see the mountain as it really is, right? You understand the mountain as a mere imputation. So it'd be a little bit like, I don't know. I'm thinking about, a common example is to think about mirrors, or like, if you have a dog that barks at a dog on the television, could you just explain to the dog that that's not a dog? That's a television set, not a dog. You don't have to bark at it, right? So, first the dog sees the dog. Then as the dog gets more educated, it realizes there is no dog. Then in the end, it gets in the level of, where we are, where you can understand and enter into the, the game in which this is a dog. But on the other hand, it's not really a dog, right? Right. So it's not like a completely crazy example. We take these appearances as having some objective basis. These things do exist, but they don't have any kind of objective basis. The way they appear, according to Prasangika, Chandrakirti, it's not just that we sometimes have some wrong thoughts about how they exist. It's that they continuously appear to our senses in a deceptive way, as though they were objectively set up and pulled together as distinct things. I think that that's somewhat like, research on the brain that's showing that even before we think about what we're seeing or discriminate a certain object, the sensory input portions of our brain are already making discriminations about things and sort of pre-processing them, identifying what the relevant objects are. It's not really that a lot of stuff that we're perceiving doesn't come to our attention. And that does come to our attention has already been sort of pre-packaged as discrete, objective entities. And that's what Prasangika is saying. It's not that, we see things just as they are, but then we make a mistake in thinking about them. It's that things constantly appear to us in a deceptive way. And once in a while, we actively, affirmatively go along with and assent to that and reinforce it, by thinking of things, that person as an objective, a real jerk who cut me off in traffic, right? That person doesn't seem like a merely conventionally designated jerk, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So that's once in a while we have this kind of like forceful manifest not just kind of passively going along with the false appearance of things as existing independent, of any kind of relevance of our perspective, but just sort of an active assent to it. So when the person comes out of meditation and a mountain is still a mountain, or I would say a mountain is again a mountain, something like that. It's not, the way that it appears is like, now you have seen a mountain for the first time. And that's like the 9th ox herding picture in the Zen way, where, you've realized emptiness, the great empty circle, and then nothing appears, and you think, oh God, how can there be any pictures after that? Well, the next picture is, coming out of meditation on emptiness. You see the trees, you see the river, you see the flowers. And you've never seen these things before as they actually are, like stripped of this overlay. I mean, from beginningless time, we've been superimposing some sort of exaggerated status on things. And now you finally see it without that. In a sense, so that's how I interpret the Zen thing. In a sense, it still does look like it's out there, but you so thoroughly disbelieve that appearance. Like, for example, when I go in the bathroom and look at myself in the mirror, I never get startled about that other man who's in the bathroom with me. But does it look like another man there in the bathroom with me? Well, I guess it does. But it doesn't even occur to me to take that seriously, right? And that's like the mind of, a person who's realized emptiness directly and then has emerged from that meditation. And things appear to them, in this superficial way as though they exist, on their own side. But they know that that's a deceptive appearance, right? So then that's what they call illusory-like appearance. Tsongkhapa is saying, there's a lot of talk about illusory appearance, and there's some traditions in Tibetan say that realizing emptiness isn't as important as generating this illusory appearance of things, right? And Tsongkhapa is saying, well, there is this illusory appearance, but it's not something you get just by spacing out meditation until everything seems a little hazy. It's something that you first have to realize emptiness, and then realize emptiness directly. And then when you emerge from it, you'll see all these forms, and you will utterly disbelieve the way they're appearing, while at the same time not discrediting the mere fact that things exist. Yeah. Okay. So one entity. Things are one entity. Ultimate truth and conventional truth are one entity. They're always right there together, locked together. So the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra, which is, actually a third turning of the wheel sutra, but, in talking about the relationship, the ultimate nature of things and things, it, gives a whole bunch of examples, just like we could think of as like a vina, like a guitar or sitar, a vina and its melodiousness, or jasmine and the scent of jasmine, or I don't know if it's a conch shell and the sound of the conch shell, or if it's the whiteness of the conch shell and the conch shell. So, you can't, the whiteness of the conch shell is not the conch shell, right? And the conch shell is not its own whiteness. Do you see what I'm saying? We don't, it doesn't even occur to us to think something so silly, right? But you can't separate them. They're always right there together, even though neither one can ever be the other, right? So this is a very, good example to think about how things that are contradictory can also be absolutely co-located. And then we just sort of take that for granted in the way we make sense out of the world. And all these examples in the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra are examples of what we say quality and quality possessor. That is something that has a certain quality and then some certain quality of that thing, right? They're all like that. So emptiness is like that. Tables, in addition to having size, shape, and color, function, they also have their final mode of existence. That's one of their qualities. So it's size, shape, color, emptiness. These are all like qualities associated with a table. So the emptiness of a table does not exist in and of itself. It exists in a relationship to, just like whiteness of conch is not a free-floating thing, is with a conch, all right? Then in the same way, emptiness of the table, we can talk about it apart from discussing the table, but it's always going to be found right there together with the table, right? Is that clear so far? Okay. So,
What school would you say that? what Min was talking about, that interpretation from the Zen, what school would you put them in? Or are they
Oh, you
from?
want me to move that Zen story into a tenet system?
Yes, please.
No.
Okay.
I'm not going to do that. No, what I do, and I was talking about this, is like, I think we all do, like Kim was talking about, she listens to this through what she knows about functional calculus, and she knows that so well that she can actually make some sense out of what we're talking about, or Min's doing his whole AI translation thing, right? And so we already know something complicated enough that we try to understand this new complicated thing by seeing to what extent it maps to or can be understood using the language we already have, right? So this is me reading Zen. You know, when I first read Zen, I thought this is a lot of nonsense because I was coming from a Gelukpa point of view, right? And then I was like, maybe I can, if I start with the assumption that it's not nonsense, what kind of sense could it be? And then suddenly so many things opened up. It's not that I understand what every koan means, but like a great many of them are directly explicable in terms of once you understand the two truths and you understand that like all of these, this is all Buddhism and they just have a different way of talking and expressing it. You know, you can easily translate it. Some forms of Zen are closer to like Tathagata Garbha way of looking at things, and in that sense might be more like Chittamatra, and other things are definitely more Prasangika Madhyamaka, but they don't use those categories, and you can't like neatly say, oh, the Rinzai people are all Prasangika and the Soto people are all Chittamatra. It's not that. They're just not thinking in those same terms. Yeah. Okay. So conventional truth. So conventional truth is, Sanskrit is samvriti satya, and the Tibetan is gunzop demba. And samvriti satya means truth for a concealing mind, truth for a concealing ignorance. Samvriti in this case means total. Vrit is the verbal root for to cover. So totally covering up truth, a total cover up truth, a truth for a mind that totally covers up how things actually are. That's kind of how the word reads. So, you know, Samvriti Satya does, in its etymology, when you look at the term, it tends to look at, you know, conventional truth from the negative point of view, right? From the point of view of its falsity, from the point of view of its not existing as it appears, from the point of view of its deceptiveness. And that's what you call it. Fool's gold is like exactly representing Samvriti Satya, that which a fool would take for gold, right? Exactly like that. Samvriti Satya, or so Gunzop, let's do Gunzop. And the Tibetan for Samvriti Satya is Gunzop Temba. And Gunzop, you know, when they explain it, because they're made this Tibetan word to represent Samvriti Satya, so they explain it, you know, the Gunzop is the concealer, which means that it is the ignorance that falsely takes these things as true. But, you know, etymologically in Tibetan, Gunzop is like, means like inflated or like fully blown up. So like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Something that looks a lot bigger than it is because it's been inflated from within, right? Something like that, all puffed up truth or something like that. So, yeah. Yeah, exaggerated, right. Yeah. So, but then, of course, if that's just what the syllables mean, it's being used to express the same idea, that the gunzop, the inflator, the exaggerator, right? Truth for an exaggerator is good, right? So there's different ways of, you know, for practical purposes, we still translate it as conventional truth, and I'll get to that in a second. But the usual term that we use to talk about it in Tibetan or Sanskrit doesn't really mean conventional. It means, obscurational or deceptive truth, or truth for a deceived mind, or something like that. It has this negative valuation. But then Gunzob Demba Samriti Satya is considered by everybody, as far as I can tell, to be equivalent and coextensive with Vyavahara Satya, which is Tanya Demba, which means conventional truth. So conventional truth doesn't come out of nowhere as a translation. It's a translation of a synonym for the word that's usually used. And, so Vyavahara Satya means something more like, transactional truth, or truth that is associated in Tibetan, as Tanya is like associated, like conventions, like words are conventions, language is a convention, and also we have social conventions, right? And so it's a truth in terms of these kinds of constructed conventions. And so, in other words, it has a truth within a framework, in a sense, right? It has truth within a framework. So say it has truth or validity within a certain framework is emphasizing a really different aspect from saying, yeah, it's something that an idiot would take for the truth, right? But these are both correct. You know what I'm saying? It's like, on the one hand, it does have existence within a certain framework for Tsongkhapa. And on the other hand, it is something that presents itself to our mind as being true, when in fact it doesn't really exist. By true, they mean existing the way it appears, right? That's what I mean. It doesn't really exist the way it appears to us.
What is the whole from Tanya Ki?
No, Tanya Demba. Tanyebe Demba or Tanya Demba, it's the same. Tanya Demba. Yeah. So I've heard, people who are tuned into this try to grope around and find some translation other than conventional truth, even though everybody knows conventional truth and they don't know the other words. So when I did my Two Truths book, I did truth for a concealer, or concealer truth, because, I wanted to be clearer about the way the word that was actually being used. Jeffrey, I think in the Final Exposition book, he uses obscurational truth. And then when he explains that, he says truth for a jerk. And I've heard people say, like, totally covering truth. It's like, right. So when you know about these words, you can see where they're coming from. They're trying to get across the aspect of the word that's being used that's not as positive, but is pointing to this deceptive quality. Okay, so that's something about conventional truths. Ultimate truth means, I don't know if there's any disagreement about it, is truth in an ultimate sense, or truth in the final sense, truth in the final analysis, something that does exist as it appears, right? It exists as it appears to the mind that knows it. So if I don't know it and I just hear people talk about emptiness, and I'm like, oh, there's this thing out there called emptiness. In addition to all the other stuff I have to learn about, there's this other thing, and so then it's not appearing to my mind maybe the way it exists, right? But when you realize emptiness, it doesn't appear to you in a tricky way and sort of falsely appear in some way other than how it is. So that's the idea. Ultimate truth is also like ultimate in the sense that it's the ultimate or final nature of things. That is, it represents how things ultimately exist. So there's how things ultimately exist is not the only fact about things. Do you see what I'm saying? It's how things ultimately exist. It doesn't mean that things aren't really what they are because they're really this other thing. No, it's like tables are tables. But what is the mode of existence? How is it that they exist as tables? When we analyze and search and say, yes, I know it holds up our books, but what is it really, right? Then when you search for the table in the parts of the table and you don't find it, and you find its ultimate mode of existence is that it's empty of any findable nature. And that's the ultimate truth, which is one aspect of the table. It's its final mode of existence. Just I'm trying to emphasize that the final mode of existence of table is not the only relevant, useful fact about the table. Because if it were, then the only useful, relevant fact about evil would be that it's empty. And the only relevant, useful fact about good and virtue is that it's empty. And Tsongkhapa is determined to avoid that, right? If we don't protect the existence of these conventional things, even though they are deceptive, if we don't protect the idea that they exist and it's possible to make useful distinctions among them, then you don't have a path, Yeah. So, therefore, you might understand that since I've said everything that exists only as an imputation by thought, everything that exists only conventionally, and there's two truths, and they both exist, one's ultimate, one conventional. The ultimate truth exists conventionally, right? It's the only way it could exist. So, what does that mean? This caused a huge problem in the history of Tibetan philosophy, because people started taking Chandrakiri seriously, and they were like, in the 11th century up until, Tsongkhapa's time and after, and they're like, what could this possibly mean? And some people concluded that the ultimate truth is completely unknowable. It has to be unknowable, because if it were known by a mind, then it would be, something that was dualistically, objectively existent, right? Whereas let me put it this way. If you have a mind that searches out how it is that things really exist, and the thing that mind realizes is emptiness, doesn't that mean that emptiness ultimately exists? It really sounds like it, doesn't it? And so some people said, all right, well, we can't go there. Everything only conventionally exists. Therefore, then they have some scripture, Shastra citations to back them up. Therefore, it seems that the ultimate is transcendent. It's inconceivable. It's unknowable. It's inexpressible. There are all these words, achintya is, Sanskrit for inconceivable. The ultimate is inconceivable. Now, we can talk about emptiness and we can realize emptiness, intellectually and meditate on it. But this is merely getting warmed up for realizing, or having an experience in nirvana where we can't talk about any specific object that's being known by the mind. Because then if we did, that object would end up being like Brahman or Atman, it would have to be the single ultimate real thing. There's an inexpressible final nature of things. People will say like that. This is still, they still say like that down to today, right? Yeah, there's lots of stuff about the inconceivability of and inexpressibility of this. And so people can take that the final nature as being something other than this kind of analytically determined emptiness object. The other conclusion that you could reach, besides saying that emptiness is just a warm-up for realizing something else which is utterly inconceivable, is you could say, well, since the ultimate mind realizes emptiness, then it means that emptiness ultimately exists. And that was the position of Dolpapa, right? And then you get the whole other empty thing, that there's one thing that ultimately exists. And so Dolpapa has a full-blown Buddhist system. So he packs within this ultimate that ultimately exists all of the bodies of the Buddha, all of the marks of the Buddha's body and so forth, all of these things, that we associate with the Buddha ground, they're all the ultimate, right? And, this is a false appearance, right? An illusion. Let's say Mim was riffing off the Vimalakirti yesterday. And so there's a scene in the Vimalakirti Sutra where, Buddha is together with Vimalakirti and all these bodhisattvas. And, I think Vimalakirti is talking about the non-duality of samsara and nirvana. And, is it Subhuti? No, it's Ananda. Who is the straight man? I forget. Shariputra, right. Shariputra says, if this is really non-dual with the Pure Land, why is it so stinky? Why are there thorns all over the place? Why is it such a mess here? And then, Vimalakirti says, that's just the way it looks to you. And then he does a little trick with his toe where he presses on the ground, and then the Pure Land appears, right? And then he lets it go back, pulls his foot back up again and off the trick lever. And then the world goes back to the way it normally appears. And so this is, a way of thinking about it that you could see. I mean, I'm not saying Dolpopa doesn't quote that or that there isn't any, thing that Tsongkhapa would get out of it. But you can see that that's the kind of thing he's going for, is like the ultimate actuality of this is, we're all in the Pure Land all the time. We're all Buddhas already, right? But you just haven't noticed it yet, right? And we're going to help you with that, right? It's not a matter of getting to somewhere that you aren't, right? Yeah. So, So, divisions within concealer truths, the different types of conventional truth. So, some Madhyamikas, Gyanagarbha in particular, but others too, say that, we can divide conventional truths into the real conventional truths and the unreal conventional truths. I mean, it seems really important for them to try to make this distinction between things that, like a mirage, an illusion, a mirror reflection, and then an actual face. And neither one of them is an ultimate truth, right? So what's the difference? They're all just illusions, The face is an illusion and the reflection's an illusion. So how do we distinguish? And you're saying, well, it's like, there's the real conventional truths, and then there's the unreal conventional truths. Okay, that's one thing, one approach. And the idea is that the real conventional truths are things that, and this is a phrase from Svatantrika, that which gives satisfaction when not analyzed. I can't make that up, right? Gives satisfaction. In other words, it serves it serves the purpose that it appears it ought to be able to serve, as long as you don't look into it too closely. Right? That's the phrase they talk about. So, real conventional truths are things that work as long as you don't analyze them. If you do analyze them, of course, you're going to end up with emptiness, right? And you won't be able to establish an ultimate functionality or workability, because these are all Madhyamikas. They understand, that everything's ultimately empty. But the problem is that, like, within this ultimate emptiness, how do we distinguish between, reflections and actual faces? So they distinguish, and this is a big discrimination between the real conventional truths and unreal. And there's stuff in Chandrakirti that can be, interpreted as making this at the end of his discussion of the two truths in Madhyamaka Avatara. But Chandrakirti seems, as interpreted by Tsongkhapa, and I think appropriately, to not want to accept that there's really such thing as real conventional truths. Or in other words, it's like, it seems like a contradiction to say that something exists as it appears, but then it doesn't exist as it appears at the same time. If something were real or true, then it wouldn't be a concealer truth. That would be an ultimate truth, right? you would end up with this idea of something that inherently had to inherently exist in order to be real in cyclic existence. So the distinction is made. We still need the distinction. So they make the distinction by way of adding a qualifying phrase. And it's like there's the conventional truths that are real in relationship to a worldly mind or relation to the world, conventional truths that are real in relation to the world, and conventional truths that are unreal, even in relationship to the world, right? So this is an important distinction in Gelukpa, that we're not going to say that there are any real conventional truths, but there are conventional truths, and they exist, and some of them, not mirrors, well, mirrors, but not, reflected images appearing as faces, are real in relationship to a worldly perspective, and others are not. So that's the way they make that distinction. And then, I don't know if you want to get into it, but then there's more arguments. There's more arguments about what is that world in relationship to which some conventional truths are real and others are not real? What do you mean by world? And this produces more arguments, because some people make the point that if there's any conventional truth that appears to a worldly mind as real, that worldly mind would have to be ignorance. That's what it means to be a concealer, is to take something as existing as it appears. And that certainly won't work if you just move that meaning over to unreal in relationship to the world, right? Because ignorance is going to take everything that appears as existing as it appears. There isn't going to be any discrediting of things as unreal. So, later tradition says, well, the world means a conventional mind that is not directed towards suchness. It means that it's not involved with meditating on emptiness or thinking about whether things are empty. It's not in the continuum of somebody who just realized emptiness and coming out of meditating on emptiness. It's the world means the perspective of a mind that's not under the influence of the ultimate mind, So because some conventional minds are under the influence, and that would be the third thing. The mountains are again mountains. That's a conventional mind, but it's a conventional mind that's fully informed by the ultimate perspective at the same time. So that's not a world. That's not the world in relationship to what's real and unreal, because everything is sort of in some ways recognized as unreal by that mind. But the distinction is in terms of if you're not thinking about that, if you're not thinking about the ultimate nature of things, right, you still have conventional valid knowledge. And from the point of view of that mind, you can distinguish that some things serve the function that they appear that they ought to be able to serve, and some things don't. That's how they make that distinction. Okay. So this brings me to the topic of how the two truths relate to the Buddha's way of knowing things. After which I'll go on to the hermeneutic topic a little bit. So as I mentioned in Tsongkhapa's presentation, the Buddha is omniscient in the sense of being able to know all phenomena, but in particular to know all conventional truths and all ultimate truths, all objects of knowledge, simultaneously without getting them mixed up. So before you become a Buddha, even if you're super advanced, you kind of have to alternate back and forth between seeing the ultimate reality and being tuned into the conventional reality. Well, once you have direct realization of the ultimate reality, you see the conventional reality as conventional. We see conventional truths all the time, but we don't recognize them as conventional truths. Why? Because we don't see the ultimate truth in relationship to understand them as merely deceptive, false appearances. So you can see conventional truths all day long without ever seeing them as that. I think we need the microphone.
I just have one comment. Can you say the Buddha sees conventional truth directly?
Yes. Yes. Buddha sees the conventional truth directly. Buddha sees. So,
Buddha imputes, so that's why.
yeah. Well, Buddha understands directly and I see where you're getting at. Yeah, Buddha directly and spontaneously sees all things just as they are. And so Buddha spontaneously sees conventional phenomena, knows them as conventional, and without in any way getting that mixed up with the ultimate nature, emptiness that she or he simultaneously is perceiving without confusion. So this is this construction of, Gunken, all knowing, is a common phrase, and there are a lot of sutra verses and things in shastras. There's a lot of Indian Mahayana literature that talks about the omniscience of Buddha, and exactly what the omniscience of Buddha means was, a topic of debate for a long time in early Buddhism, and then also in Tibet. There are different views about it. And one of the things that's interesting and probably not super well known in Gelukpa circles is that it doesn't appear that, and maybe someone will refute me someday, but from reading Chandrakirti, it does not appear that on this particular point Tsongkhapa follows Chandrakirti, because at the end of Chandrakirti's Madhyamakavatara, he talks about, he comes to the end of the path. It's a description of the practice of the path. And at the end of it, he describes what a Buddha is like. And a Buddha is not like what we just said. It's not like that. And other people who'd read Chandrakirti, like Gampopa, if you read Gampopa is, a guy who sort of was fusing Kagyupa with Kadamba lineages to some extent, and he wrote one of these first books that we had available in English, right? Was Jewel Ornament of Liberation. Jewel Ornament of Liberation. We had that book to read in English before we had many other things, right? And it's very similar to Stages of Path literature. It's not called Stages of the Path, it's called Stages of the Teaching, Denrim. So it's a slightly different genre. It just means that the order of topics is different. And what it does at the end, as is like frequently done in Tibetan texts, for the sake of auspiciousness and completion, is it ends with a discussion of the Buddha, right? What the Buddha's way of, now what this is all leading to, right? And Gampopa is following Chandrakirti. He's following what Chandrakirti says. And what Chandrakirti says is that the Buddha, it's like the fruition of the path is like the wheel of a potter that's still spinning and keeps on spinning and keeps on spinning and keeps on spinning after the potter is gone. That's what he says. So Buddha's not sitting around and thinking, shall I help those guys or not? Right? The idea is that there's continuous, spontaneous Sangye Tinle, Buddha activity. There's continuous and spontaneous Buddha activity. People aren't disputing that. They're just like, what's the inner landscape? What's going on behind, between the two ears, so to speak, right? And, Chandrakirti gives us a clear idea that it's like, this is not something that we can know or talk about. And, that to talk about any kind of consciousness that's behind the Buddha activities is going to invite, problems of dualism, that are not appropriate to, the Buddha ground. The Buddha has transcended I think people agree that the Buddha is no longer a living being, no longer a sentient being, right? But, does the Buddha still, as a non-sentient being, does the Buddha have a mind, in the sense that's distinct from a body that's knowing, objects that are distinct from it, right? And Chandrakirti doesn't seem to think that makes any sense to talk like that about the Buddha. He instead gives us this picture of, and this is, I mean, we call it Robo-Buddha. By Robo-Buddha, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I'm trying to express what Chandrakirti was talking about with this. It's like this activity keeps going on, but the work of the path, all of the merit and wisdom that's accumulated on the path is bearing fruit in this Buddha activity, right? And it's just continuous, and it doesn't require there to be some person that's back behind it, like deciding and directing it with a certain kind of understanding. That's what Chandrakirti says. And I have never heard that in the Gelukpa tradition. The only reason I know that is actually looking at the original text. And, they tell you, say, don't just read Tsongkhapa, go back and read the text that he's quoting. He quotes so many texts. Some people mistakenly say that the medium exposition of the stages of the path is a mere condensation of the great, but it's not. It quotes like 150 different Indian texts that are never appear in the Great Treatise. Now, some portions of it are summaries, but as a whole, it's a new independent composition, which makes, new arguments and Tsongkhapa knew all of this literature. It's like when you see the Dalai Lama teach, and he's going to sit down and teach the Great Treatise on the stage of the Path to Enlightenment. And before long, he's talking about, well, Dharmakirti said this, and it's like, I don't think Dharmakirti came up in the Great Treatise. Yes, but he sees all of this stuff at once, and he sees how all these things relate to each other, and he pulls in things from every possible direction. And that's the way Tsongkhapa was. He had command of this whole literature. He didn't just read it and forget about it. He was constantly pulling things from every direction whenever he was writing. Yeah, they say don't just read Tsongkhapa. Go back and read the texts he was reading. Well, if you go back and read Chandrakirti's Madhyamakavatara, it doesn't say anything about this regular standard Gelukpa description of what a Buddha is like. So it would seem that when you do the grounds and path, there's a whole literature in Tibetan grounds and path literature describes how we progress along the 5 paths and the 10 bodhisattva grounds, from here to becoming a Buddha. That literature, almost all of it, there's exception, but almost all of that literature in Gelukpa is written within a Svatantrika point of view, which they don't necessarily tell you in the beginning of the book, but it is written from a Svatantrika. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they're right. They're going to use Kamala Shila. They're for example, and other texts coming out of the Svatantrika Madhyamaka tradition, rather than just saying, well, this is what Chandrakirti said in Madhyamakavatara. So there's so much more literature that's in the Mahayana Buddhist tradition that's not Prasangika coming out of India, a more limited amount that's Prasangika. Maybe that's an excuse. But, I don't think that was I think Tsongkhapa just, this was the vision he had of what a Buddha was. And he absolutely relies on Chandrakirti, for understanding the view. And not, some non-Gelukpas think that he's misreading Chandrakirti. But he has a very convincing, argument that this is the only reasonable way to interpret Chandrakirti, right? But so it's Prasangika, as read by Gelukpas. But then when you come to understanding final fruit of the path, he's using other Madhyamaka sources rather than directly saying what Chandrakirti said. So when we talk about what the Buddha ground is like, or where the Buddha's mind is, simultaneously knowing all conventional truths and all ultimate truths. So how is that? We know ultimate truths by way of the vanishing of any kind of dualistic appearance, is usually said, right? The vanishing of any dualistic appearance is how you perceive the ultimate truth. Well, usually it's like, conventional truths in association with dualistic appearance. But Buddha also knows all conventional truths. So does the Buddha have a dualistic perception of the conventional truths?
He's able to see our experience.
Yeah, I understand. There's that, right? Right. So what about you? If the Buddha sees you having that experience, are you a conventional truth or an ultimate truth?
I'm a direct realization.
He sees you by way of seeing how you see her, and vice versa. No, you see, I'm just saying, this is just an example of the problems. It's just an example of the problems when you try to talk about omniscience. It invites a lot of complications. The Chandrakirti, bypasses by just saying that's not something that we can understand or talk about. Yeah, to be determined. Yeah, when we're a Buddha, we'll know it, or maybe not, because that might be dualistic. I don't know. Yeah. Oh, we need a microphone over the Sangmo.
Do you know why the Sarah or the Gelukpa system? Do you know why the Gelukpa system or Sarah studies the ornament using the commentary by Svatantrika, by Haribhadra?
Yeah, all of that literature is in the Svatantrika. It's all associated with Svatantrika. So you have to, if you're going to read this material, you have to read it, unless you're going to create a whole new set of literature from a Prasangika point of view, interpreting all of the topics that are in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. You have to say, well, this is the material we have, that the Abhisamaya Alankara, that takes a look at, in a synoptic way, all the things that are discussed in the Perfection of Wisdom and Sutras. And it does it from a Madhyamaka point of view. Good enough. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's not Prasangika Madhyamaka. And what was I trying to put across is Tsongkhapa emphasizes that Atisha was a Prasangika. But if you read Atisha, it's that could be. Do you know what I'm saying? It's not absolutely clear. He says some things that sound kind of Svatantrika-ish and other things that sound Prasanga-ish. And it's not, he was obviously aware of both, right? So who is Prasangika? Well, it means Shantideva seems to be Prasangika. And Jayananda, who is the commentator on Chandrakirti, claims to be a Prasangika, although Tsongkhapa says his views are nonsense and that his commentary is total waste of time. So my point is that there's, I think I made this, it's not like a proliferation of Indian Buddhist literature on all these things, that's written from a Prasangika point of view. You have to make it up in Tibet if you want it to. And that's, there is, I've seen a Prasangika grounds and paths text, but you have to go to a special trouble to sort of base your grounds and paths text off of Chandrakirti, because all of the usual ones, come out of the Svatantrika tradition. Abhisamaya Alankara is not a text that's known in China. And nowadays it is. But traditionally it was not part of Chinese Buddhism. But it was available to the Tibetans to a way to sort of, synoptically, that means in a comprehensive, pulling it all together way, look at the kinds of topics that are in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras without having to read every page of every sutra, right? Yes.
I think you said something yesterday about, you didn't use the word tradition, but you were talking about tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I was going to ask you a question about it, but I forget what that question was. But my question now is, could tradition, the tradition of the locale, have played into the way the material was they consciously presented the material because they had to fold it in to the perception of the population they were, attempting to give those new ideas to? So did they account
I pretty
for
much
for
assume.
that?
Yeah, no, I don't know exactly how that relates to this discussion, except that I totally agree with you. A good teacher, should know their audience and adapt the way they present things and what they choose to present in terms of what would be helpful to the audience. And that was actually what I was going to talk about here in the last minute about hermeneutic. all these different tenet systems are taught by the Buddha. The Buddha in Aryadeva says, something like the Buddha taught self, no self, lack of self or no self, both self and no self. He says, you taught all that, right? Why did he do that? Just to confuse us? No, it was because different people needed to hear different things on different days, right?
Well, then could our tradition that we have now be keeping us from understanding even the material that's being presented to us? I guess it could.
I'll tell you what, it's helping. It gets in the way if you become dogmatically attached to it and reify it as inherently existent, right? And then you think, oh, those evil Kagyapas and their terrible views. Do you know what I'm saying? And then it's definitely in your way. Yeah. Okay. So last topic is hermeneutic. And I already talked about what this means in general and how the two truths originally started as hermeneutic. I wanted to say something specifically about Tsongkhapa's way of doing this. So I think that, so I'll start with this. His Holiness, when he was at Lehi in 2008, commenting on the Great Treatise, he said, well, sometimes Buddha said one thing, and sometimes Buddha said something else that seemed to contradict that. And what are we going to do with that? We have all these sutras, and they say different things. So the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra puts forth a framework, a hermeneutic. There's a way of interpreting the scriptures that's in the scriptures that comes from the Buddha in the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra. Wow, aren't we lucky? So we'll look at that one and say it's the three turnings of the wheel. And it's like, it's very clearly, that there's the, basic teachings of the path in the first turning of the wheel. Then there's a teaching about emptiness, in the second turning of the wheel. But neither of them is definitive because according to the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra, which is in the third turning of the wheel, the third turning of the wheel is then the final definitive thought of the Buddha. So, that sounds good. Except if you look at the Akshayamati Nirdesha Sutra, which is another Mahayana sutra, it says very clearly that the Perfection of Wisdom sutras are the final word of the Buddha and not the Sandhi Nirmochana Sutra. Whoa. So not only does Buddha say all kinds of contradictory things, but he says contradictory things about which things we should take as his final word, right? This is like, not only is this true, Tsongkhapa says as much, and the Dalai Lama literally said just what I said. And he said, what are we to do? If the Buddha were right here, we could ask him, what did you really mean? That's what he said. And then, but since that's not the case, what do we have? We have to rely on reason. And this is the crucial thing, this is why he's Nalanda tradition, we have to rely on reason and analysis. Otherwise, we have no idea where to start. Okay, so that's the principle here is that you have to think these things through, right, and analyze it. And the next step is is that if you analyze things thoroughly, right, what are you going to determine to be the definitive? What is the definitive and what is requiring interpretation? Well, in this tradition, obviously very clear that through an analysis, the pursuit of analysis, you ultimately arrive at this idea that all things are empty and ungraspable, right? And so that must mean that the Perfection of Wisdom sutras, when they're teaching about emptiness or in fact, it could not just be only the second turning of the wheel, but anywhere, in any of the turnings where Buddha is teaching, here is like I was doing that Vajira Sutta, where the Vajira is saying, hey, Mara is trying to tempt me, but ultimately there is no self in these aggregates, right? So maybe that, could be taken as definitive. And right, so you can, when the ultimate is being taught, then we take this as the definitive, And when other things are being taught, we don't take that as wrong, but we just say that in terms of reason, searching out as far as it does, ultimately, these require interpretation to come to the final meaning. It doesn't mean that they're wrong, right? They're giving us useful information about conventional things. Why does the Buddha teach all these different things? And then I already just talked about this, but in response to your question. But I mean, the idea is that Buddha is a good doctor, right? Dr. Buddha. I always just call him Dr. Buddha with my students because they're just used to thinking about God and stuff like that. Do you understand? Yeah. So I just call him Dr. Buddha to get used to the idea that he's a spiritual physician and the Dharma is like medicine and, the Sangha are the nurses and so forth. And just like it's not, do not think good shepherd, do not think, king and Lord, do not think, Buddha's kind of like the creator, except not exactly, just stop thinking like that and just think, okay, Dr. Buddha and his medicine show. So, his Dharma medicine show. So Buddha is not like a snake oil salesman or a quack. A lot of the students don't even know the word quack. I have to teach, and they have no idea what snake oil is. I have to explain all this. Right? They're like, yeah, so Buddha's a quack. He's got snake oil. So what would that be? That would mean that he's like, this will cure cancer. This will cure acne. This will solve all the problems in your life. No matter what your deal is, this will fix it, right? So in other words, we can intuitively feel this, that we actually went to a doctor and he prescribed exactly the same medicine to every single person that would like weaken our confidence when, that one person was actually like, giving us some appropriate guidance. And so you can see that like teaching different things to different people in different contexts at different times represents what we say skill in means. It represents appropriate, intelligent care of the people who come before us. And then people say, yes, but you contradicted yourself. So what? That's not the important thing. The important thing is to say something to that particular person at that particular time that would be helpful to them. Yeah. Exactly. Where I was going, motivated by bodhicitta, motivated by the wish to become awakened for the sake of all beings, motivated by your loving care, for others. It's not just enough to have loving care for others. You have to figure out apply that, how to actually be. And that might mean that you have to learn Robert's Rules of Order, or that's just a random example. You might have to learn car mechanics. There's no telling what a bodhisattva will have to learn in order to become skillful. And you might have to become an astrologer. You know what I'm saying? You might have to become really good at the guitar. The bodhisattva is not limiting what kinds of skills, might be necessary in order to be helpful to people. And in different places, different times, different situations, that could be really different things, right? And how to get your message across. Also, aside from teaching lots of different medicines, giving lots of different medicines, Dharma medicine to different people, one of the things that the doctor doesn't do and doesn't advise, is, don't share your prescription medicine with other people. So what's a good Dharma for you is not necessarily good Dharma for the other person, right? And then also, you can't just take, gave me this medicine, gave you that medicine, gave you this medicine. What would be the best medicine? Put them all together. And one, chemistry experiment in the basement, combined. That's the comprehensive Dharma. We want all the medicine the Buddha taught. We'll just pour it all into one big thing and then make little pills out of all the medicines combined. So who would think of that? Well, somebody would think of it if their idea is that there is some kind of, I'm trying to sympathize with that point of view here for a second. It's somebody like wholeness, holistic or integrity in what Buddha's teaching, and it ought to all fit together if you can figure out how to do it. And all of it is good medicine, so, we'll take all of it at once, right? So it's not bad to learn all the different tenet systems and learn about all these different teachings, but it's not necessarily the case that you can simultaneously hold in your mind a mixture of all these things and interpret each of them in relationship to the other and thereby come out with the right view. It seems like you're going to get something very muddy, very, very confused, right? If you try to combine Buddha's teachings, which were contradictory on the surface, which were intended for different people in different situations on different days. And that is why Tsongkhapa's whole approach to hermeneutic is not just based in rational analysis of the text, but it's based in differential, analysis. For analysis, he means like making appropriate distinctions between this and this. Understanding that there's Prasangika and there's Svatantrika, and that within Svatantrika there's, Yogacara and Sautranika's versions, in terms of whether they accept the existence of, external objects conventionally. And you don't just like take all of these texts and interpret them in relationship to one another. So you don't use the sutras necessarily to interpret the meaning of the Kalachakra Tantra or vice versa. Somebody says like Kalachakra Tantra is like, highest yoga tantra. This is like, if you don't know highest yoga tantra, you're not going to be a Buddha. So when we read the Pali Canon, we should definitely read it through the lens of the Kalachakra Tantra. I mean, who would say such a thing? The answer is Dolpapa. Yes, exactly. Because he sees this as like one whole Dharma, one whole teaching of the Buddha. And the way to really understand it is to read all the sutras in relation to the tantras and all the tantras in relationship to the sutras. And thereby he creates, his comprehensive vision of what the Buddha taught, right? I mean, he understood his teaching in this way of pulling all the scriptures together. And I mean, he had vast learning and synthesizing them into one thing that he called Maha Madhyamaka, Great Madhyamaka. So it's not inconsistent. From his point of view, it's consistent with what Nagarjuna taught, but also consistent with Chittamatra too, because it's a higher level synthesis that shows you what Nagarjuna really meant by reading it through a Chittamatra and Kalachakra lens. Do you see what I'm saying? And why not? I mean, according to the tradition, Nagarjuna was also a tantric master who lived for 900 or 800 years, I forget. So one of those numbers, right? So, see, that is like for him, for his point of view, that was a sensible thing to do, I guess. One of the things that you read when you read about Dolpapa and try to understand where he's coming from with that is that he was a really serious meditator and tantric practitioner, and I think essentially he had a vision. Do you know what I'm saying? He had meditative experience of this kind of non-dual unity of things, and that the appearances that he saw around them were illusory in relationship to the fundamental unity of Buddha nature or of Buddha, the Buddha body, And so, do you know what I'm saying? I'm saying it was like not just like insane. It was based on a personal experience in meditation that he came to this kind of approach. And so Tsongkhapa is sometimes like Jangya, who the famous tenets book writer in the Gelukpa tradition. He says like the two main antagonists of the Gelukpa system, the two people who really fall beyond the pale of what we're going to count as based in the Indian Buddhist tradition, are Dolpapa and Daksan Lotsawa. And Daksan Lotsawa, came after Tsongkhapa and criticized Tsongkhapa. So then, Gelukpa tradition is all involved in criticizing Daksang for criticizing Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa couldn't defend himself, right, because of the timing, right? He passed away. But Dolpopa was the prior antagonist. He was the adversary in terms of interpreting the Dharma that Tsongkhapa not only had full access to, but had a clear understanding of how influential this was. And it's like, I think this is like, to go back to the 14th, understand many of the divisions in the Tibetan Buddhist world today, not all of them, because there's some that are specifically internal to Gelukpa, which we won't talk about. But there are, within the bigger Tibetan Buddhist world, understanding some of these divisions, it goes back to the 14th century. It goes back to the different vision or different approach of understanding things between Dolpopa and Tsongkhapa, who was constantly criticizing Dolpopa. So yeah, I guess I have just one more thing to say about that. So in Lamrim Chemo, he says, he doesn't say Dolpopa by name. So he says, there are some people who say that instead of meditating on how these things are empty, you should turn your mind to some other object and seek liberation in that way. And he said, this would be like if someone was terrified because they thought that there was a snake in their house. Instead of analyzing and searching to see whether a snake is really there, you said, don't worry about that. Look over here. That's what he says. And I think, some of the later Gelukpas, when they get mad at Daksang, they say things that are considerably meaner than that. But that's as mean as Tsongkhapa gets, He doesn't ridicule Dolpopa by name, but he does he does make mockery, essentially, of the view that Dolpopa was advocating. And he takes it really seriously as something that he sets himself in contradistinction to. The idea for him is not that there's some true reality that we have to get a hold of in relationship to which we'll realize and be free that all of this is illusion. Rather, is that we have to see right here how these things that are the basis of our fears and attachments and desires, we have to see how these things exist, right? That's where the ultimate reality is. It's not some other thing, right? Yeah, I think I ran out of things to say.
Oh, that's a good line to
Yeah. I'm happy to take any more questions, so. Yes, Kim.
That's like saying, how would the Buddha look at the four tenets?
How would the Buddha look at the four tenet system? Well, it depends on who you ask, Like, you're asking me, I was like from a this is life and legacy of Tsongkhapa, right? So Tsongkhapa says very clearly that the final teaching of the Buddha was the Prasangika Madhyamaka. And we know that because, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras are the definitive word of Buddha that Nagarjuna explained, the ultimate view of emptiness that is in there. And Chandrakirti is the one who really figured out in the subtlest and deepest way what the implications of that view is. And, therefore, the Prasangika Madhyamaka is just a way of talking about the tradition that derives from, Chandrakirti's way of interpreting. So that's, if you, ask them, it's like, another way of answering is say, the Buddha would say, whatever would be helpful to you. The Buddha wouldn't say, don't worry about those other systems. I was joking. No, it's like, it's presumably, we're going to posit that the Buddha can see your mind and know, maybe the Buddha would say nothing, right? That was one of the choices, right? And he used that one, right? Just not saying anything or saying the thing that would be most helpful to you in liberating you. Yes. How to see yourself as you really are. maybe I should recommend that book in this context. That's your implication. Yeah. The Dalai Lama wrote a very short, easy to read book on the view, and it's very intimate in the sense that it's one of the places where he talks about his own personal experiences, realizing emptiness. So yeah, it's a must read, I think, really. How to see yourself as you really are. Yeah. Okay, man. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. So can you give a brief explanation of this verse that I read somewhere? So the verse is this: mind is devoid of mind, for its nature is clear light.
Yeah. Well, I could try. Yeah. Sometimes it's understood that the sort of, there's all different kinds of levels of mind, but that the subtlest and deepest kind of mind is the mind of clear light. And what is the nature of the mind? What is the nature of the subtlest kind of mind is emptiness. So it's not like the clear light has a choice about whether to be one with emptiness or not. Even the table doesn't have a choice about that, right? So emptiness and the subtlest type of mind are always exactly non-dual, right, together. Now, sometimes we, in our ordinary lives, may briefly experience the mind of clear light without even noticing it, and we don't use it to realize emptiness. But of course, it is empty, right? And so mind is empty of mind is like kind of saying, well, the mind doesn't have any essential nature of being mind. The mind is ultimately empty. And that, emptiness is right there together with the subtlest type of mind. And when you realize, when the subtlest type of mind, the mind of clear light, realizes its own nature as empty, right, then this is the fastest way to become a Buddha, right, according to Highest Yoga Tantra.
So I have a hard time refuting like Chittamatra point of view of like you are the essence of you is foundational consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but would you be able to say something about that?
Sure. Well, first of all, you don't have to refute it necessarily, but if you one of the reasons I say that is because in addition to sort of pointing to the value of all the different tenet systems, which His Holiness has done, he's also talked about, the value, instead of thinking of the three turnings of the wheel, Dharma, which one is the best contest, right, between Sanjay Nirmocha and Akshayamati Nirdesha Sutra. It's like, you can think of it as like Buddha taught all of these things, and even though they were different medicines dispensed for different people, there may be something that we can learn from the different ones. And when he was trying to explain what he meant by that, he talked about the Chittamatra viewpoint as so obviously he's not adopting it as his final viewpoint, but like. If we set aside the question of an argument about whether there are external objects or not, and we just talk about what's appearing to us, right? Are our minds like getting at something outside our minds? This is all appearances within my mind, right? You're appearing, it's all these, these are all appearances within my mind. So Chittamatra is like a way of helping us understand this kind of way in which all of these things, all of these appearances are productions of our consciousness and the activities of our consciousness. And that kind of way of thinking about non-duality or thinking about emptiness is really useful and important. Now, how do these appearances arise, right? So, as you understand, in the Yogacara system, there's an idea that there's a foundational consciousness that, has the latencies of all of our past karma. And the idea is that as the circumstances come about that, like, to ripen these karmas, the karma ripens it blooms like this, so that it produces an objective aspect and a subjective aspect. So this, and both of these are within the mind, one entity with the mind. So there are objects that exist, but they're of one nature with the mind as things ripen from within bloom into the mental consciousness, or the sense consciousnesses from the karma stored in the mind basis of all. So if you want to criticize it, then the idea is to say, well, is this foundational consciousness permanent or impermanent, right? Is it like something that's stable and never changes, or is it changing moment by moment? If it's not changing at all, then it's not generating any experiences in the way described, right? And it's not storing any experiences. So if the foundational consciousness is like changing moment by moment, right, then we're going to have to like understand that there's no graspable, findable foundational consciousness, and that it's ultimately empty. So you can still say, it's like, well, you can believe that there's an aspect of the mind that's, generating our experiences, but it's not something that's truly foundational. That's the thing, there's the alaya vijnana, it's like, the idea that there's so in some, Dolpopa is an example, but there's lots of other examples of people who take alaya, or it's, gunshi. So it's gunshi nambar sheba in alaya vijnana in Tibetan. So, the gunshi is the basis of all, and the nambar sheba is the mind. So gunshi, it's like you say, well, here's something that's the basis of all. So it's not that I'm just tripping by pointing out that that is a foundationalist point of view. People like take that and say, when you talk about the mind basis of all, you're talking about the basis source of all appearances and reality. So there's this kind of foundational source for all the reality that's appearing. So it comes out as, from a Prasangika point of view, as being a form of essentialism or reification of the mind.
That's what goes from life to life.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it's the reason she was saying, in a Chittamatra perspective, the mind basis of all is what moves from life to life. It is the person that transmigrates, and therefore, the person is designated in relation to the aggregates in Chittamatra, but it's appropriate to make that designation because among the aggregates is the mind, and within the mind there's the mind basis of all, and that is essentially the person that goes from life to life, right? And just to remind you, what in Prasangika, they don't have anything like that. So to what is, we make an appropriate imputation of a merely conventional self in relationship to the aggregates. There's the mere I. It's very mysterious, when you hear about the mere I. It's like the person. It's like a way of saying, what is it about the person that moves from life to life? Just the mere person, just the mere I, the nominally existent person. Everything exists only nominally. The person exists only nominally. It's this mere I that we think of as this conventionally existent person moves from life to life. You can't get back of that and pin down some essence that's behind it. When you try to say, what is this mere I really? You find only emptiness. And if you find something other than emptiness, it's a superimposition of ignorance atop of this, merely conventional existence. Yeah.
I believe I've heard Lama Zopa Rinpoche say, mere cuts the true existence.
Yeah. Yeah. Mere conventionalities. Yeah, it's like, I'll just say something. I'll riff off of that for a second. Like all of these Buddhists believe in dependent arising, and and emptiness is a negation. It's a negative word. It's an absence. It's a lack. People don't necessarily dig that. You got the first noble truth. That's bad enough, and now you're talking about emptiness. Like, is this a good marketing plan? So my students are, it's like, well, if it really means like that we're all connected, why don't they just call it fullness? Well, why don't they? Why don't they? There is a reason. Because if you just think the truth of Buddhism is that everything is connected, you never deconstruct that reification. In other words, you can have a vision of everything being connected, and it's a positive, affirmative, glowing vision. But if it doesn't, critique the idea that there are real beings, there are real Wolverines and so forth that are all part of this, these real relationships in this interdependent web, then, you haven't gotten at the root of cyclic existence with this. So Buddha is like saying the root of cyclic existence, just happens to be the case, is a reification or exaggeration. If we were all born suffering so much because we were unduly nihilistic, then, it's like nihilism is a view that people adopt. It's not something that they just have innately. And so if we were all in, just hypothetically, right, we have a universe. I got this from Jose Cabezon, by the way. He said, hypothetically, if we had a universe in which everybody was innately nihilistic, then it would make sense to teach fullness as the ultimate reality. Yeah.
Maybe Rinpoche said Miracut's conventional existence. No, I can't remember.
No, I think he's probably said it the first way. Right. So yeah, so when you say conventional existence, people think, well, thank gosh, we got some existence. They're not negating everything. It's like mirror reminds you that, like, the thing is that dependent arising doesn't mean that that everything's connected. It means that nothing can exist except insofar as it's connected, and that's the mere part. Do you see what I'm saying? Mere dependent arising or mere conventionalities means, yes, these things exist. They exist conventionally. They exist interdependently, and they don't exist in any other way, right? And that is a negative part is necessary to cut back again. It's like the root of cyclic existence, as I said, is this exaggeration. So in order to have a explicit contradiction of that, you have to say something that has this negative valence, the idea of emptiness or lack or absence or no self, right? It doesn't, if you just say you're all Buddhas and like, good, I'll go home. Yeah. I mean, that's a good message for some people, right, to hear. All right. All right. But it's it doesn't have in itself, because if you say we're all Buddhas, then people will of course associate that, like they do with everything else, is that there's some essential nature that I exist by way of, and fortunately, it's the most powerful thing in the universe.
Hi. They say realizing emptiness of persons is easier than realizing the emptiness of phenomena, right? But why is that? It looks easier to realize the emptiness of phenomena because you don't have attachment to it.
Yeah. Okay, well, in Svatantrika, there can be like a difference in subtlety of these different emptiness, but in Prasangika, the subtle emptiness is the same with regard to persons and phenomena, right? So that being the case, it's not a question of like one emptiness being of a different degree of profundity than the other. So that leaves open the question is like, if that's the case, then why is it that we start with, trying to realize emptiness in relationship to the person? And here's the thing: when we meditate, if you read Lama Rinpoche, for example, he's like, okay, we're going to talk about the emptiness of the person. How do you explain it? You explain it with the example of a non-person, a chariot. It's like, in order to understand emptiness of a person, which is supposedly the easiest one to understand, we're going to give you this example of something that's not a person and show you how that thing is empty. And then you can use that to realize the emptiness of the person. In other words, good question. I think, this is just me, and I'm not going to claim any authority for this. I think it's because, the root of cyclic existence is not that I go around thinking that chariots exist by way of themselves. It's a particular kind of, it's not just a conception of true existence of persons or inherent existence of persons. It's this person. It's that, yeah. That's of all the ignorances, that's the real target. Yeah. Yes. We need a microphone.
Is it okay to make a comment?
Sure.
I think that I've thought about this a lot, because it's my special interest. I think that the reason that they do subtle selflessness of person first is that once the person gives up the sense of inherent self-existence, the next thing they do, generally speaking, what people do, is they perceive the perceptual, they blend into their understanding, they blend into the perceptual field, and there's no way to negate that because that's a phenomenon. So would be the harder to do because that's still the sense of self in a subtle way,
If you actually realize the emptiness of one thing, you're supposed to be able to readily apply it to other things. So they say, right? Yeah. I don't know. Something just reminded me of one last point I wanted to make. And how many emptinesses are there? 16, 20. 20, yeah, you've been doing Abhisamaya Alankara, right, yeah. So there are lists of, different emptinesses, of course, right. But, a message about the fact that there are different emptinesses, lists of different emptinesses, some of which seem so redundant, and like, why do we really need these things? It's just because these phrases are used at different points in the Perfection and Wisdom Sutras. They all have the same quality, which is an utter lack of inherent existence. But they have like different bases, right? So like is the emptiness of the chair the same as the emptiness of the table? Well, it's the same lack of inherent existence, but is it the same exact thing? Is it the same exact lack or absence? It's like, well, the color red is red, whether it's in the rug or in something else, right? But the color red of this rug is not identical to the color red of some other object. This sounds like an obscure point, but it turns out not to be, because if you say that there's just one emptiness because everything is equally devoid of any inherent existence, then what's the emptiness of emptiness? Emptiness is empty too, It exists only in relationship to some basis. Well, what's the emptiness of emptiness? It's emptiness. Emptiness is its own nature, right? So you have to be able to talk about like the emptiness of emptiness is a different emptiness. So do you see what I'm saying? It's not the same as the emptiness of the chair. Suppose I'm meditating on the emptiness of the chair. I realize emptiness. Oh, does this emptiness of the chair ultimately exist? No, because it's empty. Well, the emptiness of the chair is the lack of true existence in the lack of true existence of the chair. And that's not identical to the emptiness of true existence of the chair, because the emptiness of true existence of the chair is the chair's property of not being able to exist objectively, where the emptiness of the chair is emptiness's lack of having that property. you see what I'm saying? And once you, no, this matters to me because that's how you avoid essentialism about emptiness, is allow that at the conventional level, it's perfectly reasonable to talk about different emptinesses, right? Because if there were only one emptiness, it becomes really difficult to avoid monism because that emptiness is always its own essence. It's always its own final nature. If something is found as its own final nature, wouldn't that thing be inherently existent, right? Okay, well, one more question maybe? Yeah.
Actually, yes, it's a question. I thought that, your question regarding the emptiness of a self versus phenomena, it was because the Vaibhashika believed that the self is a kind of like this composition of aggregates. So the self is empty, but the aggregates are not empty under
In
the
Vaibhashika.
Vaibhashika. But the aggregates are phenomena.
Right.
And so therefore the phenomena are not empty, but the self is empty. That's how I've always understood it to be. That sentence belonged to the Vaibhashika tenet.
No, but she wasn't talking about Vaibhashika there. Yeah, but you're right about Vaibhashika, right? But that's not what she's talking about. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you for coming. Yeah.